August 15, 1925. Randwick Rifle Range, Sydney. A cold wind comes off Botany Bay and pushes the smell of burnt cordite back into the firing point. Captain Harold Hal Mercer, Australian Staff Corps, checks the clipboard again. One last line item before lunch. One last foreign gun before the committee packs up and returns to paperwork. On the bench sits something that looks wrong. Not British. Not American. Not even properly military. A boxy receiver. A long, thin barrel. A feed arrangement that makes the armorers lean closer, frowning. Mercer nods. The test firer thumbs the mechanism forward. Metal clicks. A spring hums. Then the gun erupts. Not a steady chop like a Vickers. Not the familiar stutter of a Lewis. This is a buzzing, almost airborne sound, fast enough to make the observers glance at each other like men hearing an engine misfire. And then it happens. A stoppage. A torn belt. A burst pattern that climbs like it's trying to escape the range. The report will be filed. The weapon will be boxed. And within a few years, almost nobody in Australia will admit it was ever seriously considered. To understand why Australia is even looking at a French machine gun in 1925, you have to step back into the uneasy calm of the interwar years, that strange stretch of time after the First World War when the paperwork kept moving, but the lessons were still being argued over. Australia's battlefield memory in 1925 is dominated by the Western Front. The AIF had fought as part of the British imperial system, and its automatic weapons culture was shaped by British supply, heavy Vickers guns for sustained fire, and the Lewis gun for mobile support. Those two names, Vickers and Lewis, are the poles around which Australian machine gun thinking still turns in the 1920s. But the war's end didn't freeze technology. It accelerated it. By the early 1920s, European armies are experimenting with lighter mechanisms, cheaper production, and, crucially, aircraft machine guns that demand higher cyclic rates. The aircraft problem is specific. A gun that's too slow, too heavy, or too difficult to synchronize becomes dead weight in the sky. France, bruised by 1914-18 and determined to rearm intelligently, becomes a factory of competing ideas. One of those ideas comes from an unexpected place. Darne, a Saint-Etienne firm better known for sporting shotguns, drawn into military manufacture during the Great War via licensed Lewis production. According to the Darne weapon history outlined in secondary references, the company produced thousands of Lewis aircraft guns and then attempted to better them with a simpler indigenous system. Australia's strategic situation, meanwhile, is defined by distance and budget. The Commonwealth faces the classic dilemma, a continent-sized defense requirement with a peacetime treasury. That means an obsession with weapons that promise reliability, simplicity, and economy. The kind of selling points a French manufacturer would emphasize in marketing material for a gun designed to be crude but cheap. That crude but low-cost character is repeatedly highlighted in overviews of the Darne family. So in this environment, tight money, global experimentation, and a machine gun doctrine still tied to British patterns, Australia tests foreign ideas. Not because it wants to become French. Because it wants options. The machine gun problem of the 1920s is not, how do we fire bullets? That was solved a generation earlier. The problem is how do we fire bullets under the constraints of modern war, and do it with weapons that can be produced, maintained, and deployed by a small professional cadre and part-time militia. Australia's concern is threefold. First, weight and portability. Heavy guns dominate prepared positions, but they don't follow infantry over broken ground without a team, a tripod, spare barrels, water, and a small logistics tail. Second, complexity. A design that requires extensive machining, careful fitting, or delicate components is a design that punishes an army operating far from industrial centers. Third, cyclic performance. Air forces, globally, are pushing rates of fire up. A gun that feels acceptable on the ground can become obsolete in the air. And this is where a foreign catalog begins to look tempting. Darne's pitch, as described in broad technical summaries, is that the mechanism is deliberately simplified, and the gun is intended to be economical compared with contemporaries. So the Australians put it beside what they already know and ask the only question that matters. Does it solve a real tactical requirement better than what we have? Here's the comparison. Exactly the way an evaluation committee thinks. British Lewis gun, air-cooled, proven, but bulky for its firepower. Drum magazines add awkwardness and reload friction. In aircraft use, the system works, but it isn't elegant, and it isn't cheap to sustain at scale. Darne itself had started in the Lewis business, which tells you what it was trying to replace. British Vickers, superb sustained fire, but tied to the tripod and water system. It's the king of fixed defense, not the answer to mobile firepower dilemmas. American Browning patterns, as influence, if not always in Australian racks robust, but the interwar question is whether you can get comparable output without comparable weight and cost. French Darne, the contender gas-operated, belt-fed, high cyclic rate. Often described as simple and inexpensive, but with a reputation, especially in aircraft roles, where reliability could be criticized depending on variant and mounting. Australian need, a gun that is lighter than a heavy gun system, cheaper than prestige imports, and mechanically straightforward enough to maintain in a small army, without unacceptable stoppages. That's the knife edge. Cheap is good, until cheap breaks at the wrong second. The Darne machine gun does not come out of a state arsenal. It comes out of a private firm with a name built on hunting weapons. Darne, based in Saint-Etienne, the industrial heartland of French arms, was already known for innovative shotguns when war forced the company into mass production. In 1915, they manufactured Lewis machine guns under license for the French government, producing thousands by war's end. Then comes the classic wartime moment of industrial ambition. If we can build it, why not improve it? The core story is consistent across the accessible summaries. Darne develops its own belt-fed gun during the First World War. French testing occurs in 1917 to 1918, an order is discussed, then the armistice arrives and contracts evaporate. That's the first twist. The weapon is not rejected because it fails spectacularly. It is sidelined because the war ends. In the 1920s, Darne refines aircraft variants until the design is adopted in that role. Exactly the kind of second life that interwar weapons often get. According to the broad production story, total output across variants sits in the thousands, and the design is marketed widely, with export sales to multiple countries. Now put yourself in an Australian procurement mindset in 1925. You don't have France's dense arms ecosystem. You don't have Britain's gigantic imperial supply chain. You have a small professional core and a militia structure. You read catalogs. You trial samples. You test foreign kit, quietly, because sometimes the right answer is not the standard answer. So the Darne arrives in Australia as an imported possibility, a weapon from a company trying to punch above its weight, a gun selling itself on simplicity and rate of fire, a mechanism that looks crude, because, in part, that crudeness is the point. And then Australians do what Australians always do with weapons claims. They put it on a range. They make it prove itself. Let's strip the Darne down to what it is, because the engineering explains both why Australia would test it, and why it never became an Australian standard. At its simplest, the Darne is gas-operated, belt-fed, air-cooled, open bolt, full automatic only, locked by a tilting breech block, tilting bolt, arrangement. Dimensions and baseline performance. Commonly cited base specifications for a representative ground pattern Darne list. Mass: 7.8 kilograms. Length: 1.12 m. Rate of fire: 1100 to 1200 rounds per minute. Muzzle velocity: 830 meters per second. Effective range: ground 200 m. Maximum range: ground 500 m. Feed system: belt. Now, those numbers matter. A cyclic rate above 1,000 rounds a minute isn't just fast. It changes everything: heat, ammunition consumption, controllability, barrel wear, and, on a ground mount, how quickly the gun can climb off target if the mounting is anything less than rock solid. The lock: tilting bolt, bar-like concept. The Darne locks by tilting the rear of the bolt up into a recess in the receiver roof, an approach often compared to the Browning automatic rifle locking style. If you want a mental image, think of the bolt as a lever. Forward movement chambers the round. Then the rear end tips upward, wedging into a cutout. Gas drives the system rearward, the bolt unlocks by tipping down, and extraction begins. It's solid. It's not exotic, but it's also sensitive to timing and tolerances at very high fire rates. The strangest part: the belt path. Here is where the Darne becomes instantly recognizable to anyone who has studied it. The belt feed sits in an unusual position, below the barrel but above the gas piston, and the system uses a two-stage feed where cartridges are pulled rearward out of the belt and then pushed forward into the chamber. That two-stage feed is not cosmetic. It's a deliberate mechanical decision. Most people imagine belt feed as a straight pull and push directly into the chamber line. The Darne instead performs a kind of handoff. The belt advances. A round is extracted from the belt pocket and drawn backward. The mechanism then lifts or positions it to align with the bore. The bolt pushes it forward into the chamber. It's a little like moving a cartridge from a conveyor belt into a loading chute before ramming it home. The advantage is controlled presentation. The disadvantage is complexity in motion. More timing points, more potential for a feed disruption if belts deform, if lubrication changes, or if parts wear. Why this appealed in the 1920s? Darne's design philosophy is repeatedly described as aiming to reduce manufacturing cost by avoiding unnecessary refinements, even if the external finish looks crude. Wikipedia. That matters in procurement terms. A nation can sometimes tolerate a rough exterior if the interior geometry is consistent and the gun runs. Darne also offered the basic action in multiple configurations: infantry guns with buttstock and pistol grip, vehicle and fortification patterns, and a set of aircraft variants including synchronized versions. That modularity is a salesman's dream. One mechanism, many mounts, many buyers. Caliber reality: not one gun, but a family. Darne guns appear in multiple chamberings depending on customer and time period, including 8x50 mmR Lebel, .303 British, and later 7.5 by 54 mm MAS on updated models. That matters for an Australian test in 1925 because caliber compatibility is politics. A gun that can be supplied in .303 British fits imperial logistics thinking. A gun requiring French ammunition does not. The elephant in the room: cyclic rate versus control. 1,000+ RPM on a flexible mount can be an asset. In the air, you want dense shot patterns in a short firing window. On the ground, especially on lightweight tripods or bipods, such a rate can become a liability. The gun isn't bad because it is fast. It becomes hard to justify because a fast gun demands a stable system, disciplined bursts, and a supply chain willing to feed it. And that is precisely why a range trial can look impressive for 5 seconds, then unsatisfying for 5 hours. Now, if you're finding this interesting, consider subscribing. We're building something here for people who actually care about the details. It takes a second, costs nothing, and helps the channel grow. Here's the uncomfortable truth about this episode in Australian weapons history. Australia tested the Darne in 1925, but the Darne is not an Australian combat weapon. Its story, in Australian hands, is a story of evaluation, not battlefield adoption. So combat effectiveness has to be approached honestly. What did the weapon prove in service elsewhere, and why didn't that translate into Australian issue? The Darne in actual service. Aircraft first. The most consistent operational thread is that Darne succeeds most clearly as an aircraft gun, adopted in French service in the interwar period and used until replaced by the Mac 1934 for the Air Force, with naval use lingering into the Second World War. That placement tells you what the gun was for. Not trench sustained fire. Not jungle patrol support. Aerial bursts, turret work, and synchronized mounts. And for that, the very high cyclic rate is not a gimmick, it's the point. Captured and repurposed. Another key combat note: captured French Darnes were used by German occupation forces for coastal defense, with a German designation given in some references. That is a kind of backhand compliment. Armies don't reissue utterly worthless guns in wartime if they can avoid it. They use what functions, especially in fixed roles where mounts and ammunition supply can be controlled. So the Darne can be effective, particularly when it's mounted firmly, it's maintained carefully, and it's fed with belts that match the mechanism's requirements. Reliability. The split reputation. Here's where the Darne becomes divisive. On one hand, the design is described as working well despite crude finish and being cheaper than contemporaries. On the other, aircraft variants are often criticized for reliability, depending on configuration and context. Those statements can both be true. Reliability is not a single number. It's a relationship between the environment, the operator, the mounting, the ammunition and belts, and the maintenance cycle. A weapon can be perfectly reliable on a test bench and miserable in dust, or superb in naval aircraft and unhappy on a rough ground tripod. Why Australia didn't take it forward. Now we bring it back to Australia's 1925 trial. If you're an Australian evaluator in the interwar years, you're not just measuring the gun. You're measuring what adopting it would mean. Spare parts would come from a French supplier network. Ammunition compatibility would be a constant question, even if .303 variants exist. Training would diverge from British standard practices. Doctrine would need a reason to change. And the biggest issue of all, Australia already has a workable machine gun ecosystem built around British weapons. The Vickers is entrenched as the heavy gun. The Lewis is already proven as a lighter automatic arm. The Darne must not only function, it must outperform enough to justify disruption. A high cyclic rate is impressive, but it can also be interpreted as wasteful on the ground. A gun that burns belts at over 1,000 RPM demands ammunition stocks a peacetime defense budget doesn't like. So when the gun produces stoppages during a trial, torn belts, feed hiccups, or patterns that climb off target, those aren't just minor faults. They are procurement poison. Because they translate into this sentence in a committee member's mind. If it does this on a Sydney range, what will it do after 6 months in a depot, handled by militia, fed by mixed belts, and cleaned on weekends? That's why a weapon can be good and still fail an adoption pathway. The Darne's battlefield value, in one line. In practice, the Darne's combat value rests on two things repeatedly visible in its story. It is mechanically interesting and potentially economical. It finds its real home as an aircraft gun rather than a universal infantry solution. And Australia, in 1925, is not buying an aircraft future from a private French firm. Australia is guarding an empire standard present. The strategic impact of the Darne in Australia is not, it changed the battlefield. It's subtler, and arguably more revealing. Australia's willingness to test a Darne in 1925 shows an interwar defense culture that is quietly pragmatic. Even while doctrine and identity remain tied to Britain, the Commonwealth is willing to look sideways at foreign solutions when local needs don't perfectly match imperial assumptions. That matters because it hints at a pattern that becomes unmistakable later. When Australia faces unique operational demands, especially in the Pacific, Australians become far more willing to pursue distinctive equipment choices. The Darne trial sits early in that long arc. It's an example of the Army and its technical services asking, is there a better way to do this? Even if the answer turns out to be, not this way. It also highlights a procurement truth. A weapon's strategic value isn't just its muzzle velocity or rate of fire. It's the degree to which it fits the nation's supply chains, the training system, the industrial base, and the likely theaters of war. By those measures, the Darne's influence is indirect. It doesn't change Australian doctrine, but it reinforces the importance of testing rather than buying on reputation. And if there is a final strategic irony, it is this. Darne's attempt to win ground gun markets fails widely. Its aircraft role is where it finds sustained adoption. Australia's 1925 interest shows the same temptation many armies felt, trying to treat an aircraft-optimized concept as a universal solution. The trial helps close that temptation, at least for that moment. Darne production is best understood as a family output, not a single model run. Multiple summaries state that Darne built the mechanism in numerous variants: infantry, fortification, aircraft, synchronized, and sold to several countries, with France as the largest user and foreign clients making up the remainder. The broad end of the line is also consistent. French Air Force use is eventually replaced by the Mach 1934, while French naval aviation retains Darne longer, and captured guns see German secondary use. For Australia, the service life is essentially a trial life. An imported evaluation sample, a set of range assessments, and then storage, disposal, or quiet archival existence. If you're looking for surviving examples today, the best public-facing path is museum and collector channels internationally, particularly where Darne aircraft guns have survived as rare pieces. One modern reference point is that the mechanism has been documented with manuals and filmed examples, including access via the Cody Firearms Museum for a filmed aircraft pattern Darne. Collector interest tends to follow rarity and mechanical oddity. The Darne has both. It is recognizable, historically linked to interwar aviation, and mechanically distinct in its feed. The Darne's legacy is not that it became the world's dominant machine gun. It's that it embodies a specific interwar idea: industrial pragmatism. A private maker, known for sporting arms, attempts to produce a belt-fed military system designed for economy and modularity, then sells it into the one niche where its strengths are undeniable: aircraft mounts requiring high rate of fire. Mechanically, the Darne's tilting bolt arrangement belongs to a wider family of locking concepts used in successful weapons, and the gun's two-stage feed remains a talking point precisely because it is so unusual. In Australian weapons history, its legacy is even more specific. It is a reminder that the Commonwealth did not simply accept British patterns without question. Trials of foreign systems, successful or not, are part of how Australian small arms thinking slowly matured into a more independent approach later in the century. The Darne didn't change Australian doctrine, but it reveals Australian curiosity. And in procurement history, curiosity is often the first step toward real innovation, whether the path leads to adoption or to a firm no. 1.12 meters of steel, the belt feed that pulls backward, then pushes forward, the cyclic rate that sounds like a saw blade. This was the weapon that promised economy, promised simplicity, promised a new answer for a small army watching every pound and every shilling. This was the weapon that impressed on paper, challenged in practice, and vanished into filing cabinets when the day's firing ended. This was the weapon that proved, quietly, that Australia would test anything, believe nothing, and adopt only what fit. The great powers had arsenals. Australia had scrutiny. And back on that windy Sydney range in 1925, that scrutiny was the real weapon.